Hi, I'm Whitney Espich, the CEO of the MIT Alumni Association, and I hope you enjoy this digital production created for alumni and friends like you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Rick Lufkin, class of 1968, and honored to be the current chair of the Cardinal and Gray. Sadly, I am not actually seated in the Barker Engineering Library right now, but rather, like many of you, alone in my office in front of my computer. That's the way it is these days. Welcome to the first in our fall series of talks. The Cardinal and Gray Society looks at research and learning at MIT. The world keeps spinning. Let me also extend a warm welcome this afternoon to the Emma Rogers Society members joining us today. Your continued loyalty and engagement is very much appreciated. We are grateful today to have the opportunity to hear from a most distinguished MIT professor. I'll introduce him by providing you with a small subset of his accomplishments. I hope you will forgive me for omitting the rest. Professor Sanjay Sarma is the Flowers Professor of Mechanical Engineering at MIT and the Institute's Vice President for Open Learning. He was one of the founders of the Auto ID Center at MIT, which developed the concepts and standards of modern radio frequency identification, RFID, now used by over 1,000 companies on 5 continents. No doubt you are all familiar with the end user side of these technologies. Professor Sarma serves as the chair of the GS1 Innovation Network and on the boards and advisory boards of a number of other well-established and startup companies. In many of his endeavors, he has been at the forefront of technologies now known as the Internet of Things. Professor Sarma is co-author of the award-winning book, The Inversion Factor: How to Thrive in the IoT Economy. Dr. Sarma received his bachelor's degree from the Indian Institute of Technology, his master's from Carnegie Mellon, and his doctorate from Cal Berkeley. He has authored over 150 academic papers in computational geometry, sensing, RFID, automation, and computer-aided design, and is the recipient of numerous awards for teaching and research. He advises several national governments and global companies. In his new book, Grasp, Professor Sarma has drawn on his years of experience directing MIT's many online learning systems, including MIT X and OpenCourseWare. With lessons from the use of these platforms and from ongoing research in cognitive science, he offers a vision of how teaching and learning can be radically improved using new methods. Before I pass over the virtual mic, I want you to know that you will have the opportunity to ask questions after his presentation. Please use the Q&A feature of Zoom at the bottom of your screen. Now, please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Sanjay Sarma.
Thank you very much, Rick. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you about these strange times. I'll start by talking a little bit about where we find ourselves and also offer the view that we have an opportunity to reset a little bit in our educational systems. Hopefully this dark cloud has a silver lining. So here we are in Zoom, in our various basements and offices, and humanity hangs by a thread. I like to say that the 21st century didn't begin in 2001 or 2000, as depending on how you count. It really begins in 2021 because entire industries, entire sectors will be transformed, and we're all hanging by a thread, which is technology. Technology is always good to have. We did what we did before, somewhat better with technology. But here we are as an entire planet hanging by this good to have, which has become our only have. And so when 2001 rolled around, Google was already there, Amazon was already there, but here we are depending entirely on Zoom and Google Hangouts and Amazon for home delivery and so on. So this is a transformative year, and next year is the beginning of a new normal, or perhaps a new abnormal, as some people like to put it. And education is no exception. This spring, 1.6 billion students were separated from their teachers and from their institutions. And around the world, they were either receiving online instruction or some sort of jury-rigged form of instruction. When we talk about online instruction, it's really not what I would call cutting edge online. What they're receiving is the worst of both worlds. On the one hand, they're receiving something that we in universities have been doing for 1,000 years, which is one-way lectures. And we're doing it on Zoom now. And in Zoom University, you have neither the charm of in-person nor the benefit of true cognitive science, unfortunately. And in any case, true online, which any of you can see if you just go to YouTube and type in Khan Academy or OpenCourseWare, or for example, 3 Blue, 1 Brown, which is Grant Sanderson's channel, or Minute Physics, or Physics Girl, who's a physics graduate from MIT who does physics experiments that are amazing. That's true online. Zoom University isn't that. Zoom University is us sort of managing and doing lectures online. True online is asynchronous videos which are well produced to excite students, to get them interested, so they do it on their own accord. And it is magnetic in its power. And then you can do other things. For example, you can do online assessments, you can gamify it, and so on. So Zoom is sort of the worst of both worlds. So when this pandemic, which has confiscated the privilege of in-person from us, when it eventually, hopefully recedes and we're back in person, I hope the entire educational establishment wakes up, and rather than recreating what we're doing in Zoom, except we're doing it in person, I hope we look back on what we've been doing, recognize that it's based a little bit on historical dogma, and rethink education. So let me talk about that a little bit. So our educational system as it stands today, if you look at the history of universities and schools for that matter, the earliest universities were the universities in Asia, going back Takshila, which was in ancient Pakistan, was a Hindu and then Buddhist university, and the Chinese universities and other Hindu Buddhist universities. And they got wiped out by the 5th, 6th centuries during invasions. But some of those ideas survived. And then you go to the Islamic universities like Al-Qawayarim in Morocco, which was founded probably around 900 AD. It's still a running university, believe it or not, and Al-Azhar. And then, of course, the Oxfords and the Bolognas in Europe, which actually owe a little bit to the Islamic universities. That's where they got some of the concepts. In fact, the first degree was something in Arabic called ijazats, which means permission, because you gave a scholar the permission to teach someone else. But they were all based on monastic traditions. So they all came from, educating on the holy book, Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, Jewish, and also Islamic. And those were great sources of learning. That's where a lot of our traditions come from. And so those universities continued for centuries. And then around the Industrial Revolution, there were a couple of needs. One was the need to educate, of course, workers, but also the need to educate the workers' children, almost childcare. And so that and other trends sort of came together to define what is today modern education. And it is based on all sorts of dogmas, but the most fundamental dogma, which I think is, I hope you will see and agree with me, is unfortunate, is this. It is the implicit assumption that the professor holds the pen and the student's brain is a sheet of paper. And all the professor has to do is write on that sheet of paper and declare victory. And that is the fundamental dogma of the lecture. MIT was established, as you know, 1861, 1865, when you got going. It was established with very different principle. It was established in what we now know from Piaget and the MIT professor Seymour Papert as the constructivist philosophy. And the basic idea here is the professor isn't writing on the student's brain. The student is building a model of the world. And the professor is feeding that model as the student needs it. And it's constructivist because students are, on the one hand, constructing things, which is MIT, but also in the process, constructing a mental model of the world. It's sort of like a plant. You don't give a plant water when you want to give the plant water, or a baby or a kitten, right? You don't just give the plant, it's the water it needs in a lifetime the first day and then declare victory. You give the plant water, sunlight, potassium, nitrogen, as the plant needs it. In fact, it's called precision agriculture. But we have made that assumption with learning, and that is fundamentally false. The science of learning tells us some amazing things. We are 100 billion neurons, and we construct a model of the world by pruning the brain. The human baby is very unique in other animals in that it is immature for 15, 20 years. Most animals become mature very fast. And the reason is that learning, which is a human prerogative, is what makes us so adaptable. We can live in the Sahara, we can live in the Arctic, and we can live in all places in between. And that adaptability is learning. And the human prerogative is that a baby is designed to learn. We're a learning animal. And a parent is designed to teach. We're a teaching animal. And all these principles actually show up in the cognitive science of learning, not just for young people, but also for old people. It's the same instinct. I'll give you some. For example, every lecture is what, 40 minutes, 90 minutes, whatever. And that's a made up number. That's a number based on the clock. It's not based on any understanding of human science. It's sort of like medicine before the turn of the century, of the last century, before we entered the 20th century. We had no X-ray, we had no genetics, we had no biochemistry. Imagine dealing with COVID when you didn't have that. All you could do is bleed someone or send them to get fresh air. We didn't have antibiotics. And learning is sort of caught in that world. And somehow we let it go. Because we know now that lectures should be about 10 minutes. And the reason is when a student, when the human brain is absorbing stuff, this, by the way, is called the prefrontal cortex. I think of it as the CEO of the brain. We get stuff in through our senses, and then the hippocampus is a traffic cop, and it's forming memories. And at about 10 minutes, basically, you can't digest anymore. You can only digest up to a chunk. And then the brain has to go into this mode, which literally is called mind wandering. Literally, that's the technical term, mind wandering, where the brain is sort of taking the stuff, making sense out of it, integrating with other things you've learned. And what we do in lectures, we go on for 45 minutes. And after 10 minutes, the student's brain wanders, we sort of yell at them. We make them feel guilty. The index finger is what we somehow think we can get over the limitations of the human brain. It's not a limitation, it's actually a beautiful thing. At the end of 10 minutes, what should we do? We should be asking individuated questions of each student. Well, what did you think of that? And that actually promotes long-term memory. We don't do that because it's inconvenient. And there's all sorts of other things. By the way, every parent knows this. Every parent knows, can see, almost feel from the back of a car, when the child's eyes glaze over. You can almost feel it in the back of your head. And you know to pause. Here's another thing. It turns out that forgetting is a fundamental part of learning. When you're forgetting something in the brain, what's happening is the synapses, when you form short-term memory, the synapses connect using a neurotransmitter. And when you are forming long-term memory, extra synapse, like if physically the brain, the neurons drop new connections. And short-term memories, when you begin to forget them, if the student is reminded, the brain recognizes that and drops long-term memories, drops extra connections, and it's called long-term potentiation. It's actually one of the explanations for something called long-term potentiation. But the point is, we treat forgetting as a sin, whereas it's such a natural thing in the human brain. We should be recognizing and encouraging people to come to the point of forgetting and then remind them. But instead, we treat it as some sin. And why do we treat it as a sin? Because it's so damn inconvenient. So we just ignore it. We yell at the student and move on. And every parent knows this as well. It turns out the best way to learn, based on what I just said, is you want to let people forget things and then figure out they're forgetting them and then sort of remind them. And a parent knows that, you don't want to, when you're teaching your child something, you teach them, let them back off, you back off when they're done. And then, when they're in the right mood in the back of the car, maybe you hit them up again. You say, hey, what about that thing? Because you're actually instinctively applying some of the principles I applied. When I started studying what cognitive neuroscientists have learned over the last 150, 20, 10 years, I began to realize that rather than these learnings, rather than being sort of cold-blooded and clinical, extremely warm and intuitive, and they reminded me of parenting on and of being a child. There are other principles. For example, here's one. this, by the way, applies not just in learning something, but also in learning sports. In fact, I'll give you a sports example. So let's say that you are playing a sport like tennis. Should you be doing, standing in the backcourt and hitting, backhand behind the line, long backhands, or are you better off doing backhand volley, backhand, baseline volley, baseline volley? The research in sports and in learning shows you're better off switching baseline volley, baseline volley. Why? And if you're learning, I don't know, impressionist paintings, and if it's Seurat, Monet, and you're studying Seurat and you're studying Monet, you're better off doing Seurat, Monet, and not Seurat, Monet, Monet, Monet. But yet every book and every teaching instrument is based on chapters where you do the Seurat and chapters where you do the Monet. If you're doing, calculate the surface area of a sphere and the surface area of a cone, it's better to do sphere, cone, but every book is spheres and cones. That's called interleaving. And the science shows it. And the reason is because of two things. One is we learn from the contrast. And the second thing is the actual learning is not the equation for the sphere. The actual learning is recalling and reloading that equation, or relearning the algorithm for the backhand volley as opposed to the backhand baseline shot. So these are all things, and I've write about them in my book, and others have written about them. But these are all amazing things that every parent knows, but that we completely ignore in the classroom. And instead, we waste the classroom, frankly, on one-way lectures. And especially at MIT, we've tried to keep the tradition of the workshop alive because of our mens et manus ethos, but also because if you look at the main campus of MIT, you see it behind me. If you recall, the ceilings are all very high, and the reason is it was a workshop, right? I mean, there's a reason we have a guy with a sledgehammer on our logo. And so the opportunity here for all of us is to really, when nature, which is confiscated proximity from us, when it returns it to us, we should, when we have the privilege of being back together, we should really, really think about how are we going to make being in person count rather than squandering it, frankly. I'm talking less about MIT, but even about MIT, but really all of education, rather than squandering it on one-way lectures. So what's the future? Well, the future is asynchronous online videos, which is what we do with MITx, which is what we do in OpenCourseWare. And I consider myself a pretty good teacher, but I am humbled every time I go to YouTube and I look at some of the videos on math or physics or history that are out there from unknown people who are passionate and who put a lot of effort into how to explain something. Asynchronous videos. Now, if you then build a scaffolding around that asynchronous video where you apply some of the tricks I described, such as 10-minute lectures, spacing out learning and looking for forgetting, or encouraging forgetting and then hitting people up, you can actually do that. Language programs do that, like Babbel or Duolingo, or interleaving. If you build a scaffolding around that, the online piece can do a much better job than the regular lecture. In addition to everything else, the professor can pause, the student can pause the lecture, fast forward. The favorite speed at which students listen to lectures today is about 2x. Rewind if they have to. Or if they're distracted, they can pause it. You have none of those advantages in a lecture hall. And all you get is the finger wave. So if you did that, actually, students would learn better from the lecture. But there are things that we can do in person that you can only do well in person. And let's talk about that. One, so there's research at MIT and other places that shows that the equivalent for hunger and saliva for the mouth is curiosity and dopamine in the brain. If you make a student or a person curious, adult, child, doesn't matter, a circuit in the brain called the dopaminergic circuit is awakened. And that is the learning circuit. That's our human instinct. Curiosity. If we spend the classroom working on context and curiosity, and by the way, you can do that way better in the classroom in that beautiful campus or any campus than you can do online. Online's getting pretty good at it. So we got to up our game. then that's something that we should focus on. But that's just the start. Now, let's say you wake someone up with curiosity and you are able to get people going, and now they can go consume the online content. And when they consume the online content, they really get it. It's exciting. Now they come back into the classroom. Now you work on what? You work on the things that MIT cares about. And by the way, William Barton Rogers absolutely nailed it. When I started this research, I was concerned that it would be embarrassing if some of the science showed that mens and manas was a bad idea. But I'm happy to say he absolutely nailed it. Because when you come back to the classroom, you were first made curious, then you went and consume the online content. Now you work on the things that make you remember things better and really learn. One, you learn and you do projects. Two, you do discussions, disputation. You do problems. You do your homeworks in front of the professor. Or as you're doing projects, the professor looks over your shoulder and does something really incredible. It's the C word, coaching. There's a lot of research on the power of world-class excellence. And there's a particular book actually that I recommend by someone by the name of Anders Ericsson on the science of expertise. And he was studying things like, how did Mozart end up with perfect pitch? Is it a God-given gift? That was the assumption. But what he was able to show, and actually the Japanese are able to show, and he reports it in his book, Peak, The Science of Expertise, is that that coaching can actually create world-class behavior, and perfect pitch, the Japanese are able to show, can be recreated. And the Japanese experiment, which he refers to, shows that perfect pitch is not God-given. You have to start young, it's a certain age group, but you can create with a high probability perfect pitch. So in the classroom, we should be focusing on initially context and curiosity. Students go away and do online, come back, coaching, projects, agency. That's the third thing. You want students to walk away with agency. I'll end with this. COVID is going to really change the world, as I said. Entire industries have been devastated. Retail, for example, commercial real estate is being impacted. Companies aren't going to grow in the next year. Some will. Zoom exceeds all the airlines, I believe, in valuation together. But many companies won't. And so we're in for the gig economy. The future of work is that more and more people will be self-employed, freelancers, which is great. We're all going to become, more and more of us are going to become, free agents. Regardless of whether you believe in the gig economy, this is not a bad thing. But our students will need two things to survive in this world. And the first is agency, an ability and a self-efficaciousness to actually take on challenges and to do things. And many of you have achieved that. And I think we want more of our students to have that. But the second is our students are going to have to become learning animals. They're going to have to become the chief learning officers of their own lives. And perhaps even more importantly, the CEOs of their own life. And if you look at our educational system today, to a large extent, it is designed around teachers and professors. That's got to end. We've got to see our goal, our purpose, as transforming every individual student and enabling them to achieve their fullest potential. And that means it's no more about sitting students down and giving lectures. And by the way, we have great lecturers. That's not the point. It's about creating systems where students can thrive and using all the science we've learned about learning and to deploy it. And during COVID, young people will have spent a year training in this new world. I look at my own daughter, and she is out there scouring the web looking for videos. She has a good ear and a nose for what's valid and what's not. And so when she walks into the classroom, I think she'll expect something different, and we better be ready for it. And that's basically what MIT's done. So with MITx and edX, maybe clarify, about 20 years ago, we started OpenCourseWare, where MIT gave its curriculum away for free to the world. That reports to me now. And that's 500 million downloads. It's really staggering, very reassuring, right? If you go to Facebook, people put up pictures of the hummus, the hummus they made last night. They go open course where they're actually downloading content on quantum mechanics or linguistics. It's really great. Then in 2011, we launched something called MITx. MITx is basically a course, and it has videos with interleaved problem sets, the things I mentioned. Each video is 10 minutes. So we built a scaffolding that is cognitively friendly. And it's also asynchronous in the sense that you can watch the video now. If you're bored, you can pause. If you're tired, you're hungry, come back and watch it in the evening. But every week there are assignments. At the end of it, there's a final exam. You get an exam. You get a certificate. We built that. We gave it to the world. And we also deployed in our own classrooms to flip the classroom. So everything I described, where you do a different set of activities in the classroom, is called flipping the classroom. So we did that with MITx. Once we created MITx, we realized that we needed to separate the content production from the platform. So we created something called edX. So MIT and Harvard invested tens of millions, $40 million each, and we set up edX. edX is a nonprofit entity. The CEO is an MIT professor, an entrepreneur himself, and he's the person who created MITx in the first place. And MITx now is the content producer. Harvard does HarvardX, Caltech is CaltechX, and edX, think of it as YouTube where we run these courses. So that's what MIT's done. And with this, we hope to impact not just the vision of democratizing education, but applying all the principles that I described to you, cognitive science, et cetera, and flipping the classrooms at MIT and other schools flipping their classrooms. And they don't have to shoot their own video. You can do a lot worse than I mean, someone like Eric Lander giving a biology course. Some teacher somewhere might as well take advantage of it. You can do a lot better than Eric Lander. And so that's the system we've set up. And when we come back from Zoom University and resume regular education, I have a feeling this is the future we will all head into for all the reasons I described. Maybe one comment I'll say is our students right now, 3/4 of them are at home. Some are doing okay, some are not. Many of our students come from one of the great things about MIT is how inclusive we are. And a lot of our students come from tough circumstances. I mean, they might have an internet connection. We sent out hotspots to them. They may not have a room where they don't have a young sibling in the same room. It's hard for them to focus and concentrate. So it's been a mixed bag. MIT's done everything it can. I think we've been really generous. We've sent out iPads to all our students. We're giving them $5,000 of grants so they can buy technology or use it another way. Some students are using it to buy food, for all we know. So we've done everything we can. These are not easy circumstances, but I hope we learn from it. I'll stop there and back to you, Rick.
Thank you, Professor Sarma. I am always tremendously impressed by the ability of MIT professors to articulate extraordinarily complex ideas in words that even I understand. So I'm always impressed. Ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to start by just a reminder. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Feel free to communicate with me via that feature. I will read your questions, and Professor Sarma and I will then have a dialogue. We did get one question seeded in advance by Tom Walonis from South Carolina. Mr. Walonis says, quote, what do you think the new normal will be after the pandemic regarding online learning for tertiary level undergraduate students? Will there be a return to primarily face-to-face, a blend of face-to-face and online, or a greater interest in online learning?
I think that, I wrote an article about this a few years ago, and this is a few weeks ago, seems like years ago. And what I said was this: the universities that up their game on in-person education will end up doing blended learning more and more. In other words, if you make the in-person experience, everything online couldn't possibly do, the coaching, the projects, you can't do that online, it's harder. Then we'll end up in blended. I think a bunch of universities will try and go back to the old normal. In some countries, they'll be protected by regulation and signaling value and tradition. In America, a lot of private colleges, unfortunately, because they actually have their pedagogy right, but they may not be able to up their game fast enough. I think many will die. So it's going to be tough, unfortunately. And I think, and when they die, a lot of their students will be orphaned. And where are they going to go? They're going to flop to online, right? If they can't transfer to other schools. So I actually see a massive increase in online. I am Mr. Online. I lead it. But I have to tell you, I would never trade good in person for online. I would not even close. But I will say, good online will kill indifferent in person. So I hope that answers that question.
Let me build on that to a degree. You mentioned earlier how wonderful it is to listen to Professor Lander speak on biology. To what extent will our educational system become overly focused on stars such as him? And you point out earlier that the other institutions may weaken, and yet we have this, quote, star focus, that it has the potential to completely change the dynamics and the economics of education.
Potentially, but I actually think we shouldn't look at it that way. I actually think coaching is the true stardom. Okay. And everyone can be a great coach. So what if, look, I read, when I studied engineering, I had a textbook from MIT, from Crandall, Dahl, and Lardner. Professor Crandall was still around when I came back, and he was a god to me. I'd never met the man, but my coach was the professor in India who really brought it to life. So similarly, people will see Professor Lander present biology, but the coach at the local university who says, here's the chlorophyll that, we extracted, here's how it behaves, and here's how to think about the chemistry. That is the true learning. So let's focus on coaching, is my view.
Thank you. Another question from Richard Tavan. How will we retrain our teachers, veterans, and emergers to succeed in this new educational paradigm?
It's going to be, I cannot say I have an answer to that profound question. I do, by the way, the last people to blame in all this is the teachers. The people to blame are the structures, the structures that limit them. My mother was a teacher, and I can tell you that that she would have agreed with everything we're discussing. She does actually. I asked her about it. And the problem is the teachers are limited by the structure. So we need to, in my view, as much as we empower teachers, and we also jerk the teachers around, the pendulum swing of fads, do this, do that, do this, do that. It's just sort of, we don't pay them enough. So we have to address that. But I think we need to fix our structure. Veterans, I come from a military family, as I was mentioning to Rick earlier. I hadn't even thought of that, but I think that's a great opportunity because they bring so much life experience. My grandfather, who was in World War II, was really my first coach, and the sort of wisdom he brought. So that's a great opportunity. I don't have an answer only because I haven't thought too much about it, but it seems very attractive to me.
Joel Winnett asks, should we do more than remote? Should we do more than remote Zoom by having interactive online teaching?
Without a doubt. Zoom, as I said, is the worst of both worlds. Honestly, I'm not teaching this semester, but I would have said if I taught, I would have used my iPhone. Actually, I did that with another course that we taught in the summer, and shot videos and said to the students, watch those videos. And when we meet in Zoom, it won't be 90 minutes of red eye. It'll be 45 minutes of active discussion. Let's say I'm teaching you dynamics. I would have said, watch my video on the math of dynamics. I'm going to make sure you watch it because I'll see that you logged in. And here's a project. I want you to find everything in your house that vibrates. A window that vibrates when there's wind, the washing machine, the dryer. I want you to maybe use write a program to use your smartphone to figure out the frequency of that. This is very MIT, right? Actually, one of our colleagues did that. And when we come to the classroom, we're going to look at the vibration and try and figure out, we'll guess what it was from the output and what the input was and what the transfer function is. So that's how I would do it for sure. But my God, just blathering on Zoom like I'm doing now. Unfortunately, I don't blame teachers for doing it. We were all caught unaware. So we've struggled, but hopefully we'll get out of it.
Tom Neal makes an articulate observation. Your talk was easy to follow and profound. Thank you. Somewhat tongue-in-cheek, he states. Did you break it up into 10-minute segments?
I actually did. And actually, the funny thing is that when I give this talk, I break into 10-minute chunks and I ask questions. So let me ask you all a question. What is this thing called?
Prefrontal
Anyone?
cortex.
Excellent, sir. You got it. So I'm going to remind you again tomorrow. But yes, you're exactly right. I'm violating that principle, Tom, and guilty as charged, although you were very gentle about it. And the problem is a lot of our structures are based that way, right?
Yeah.
The way we should have done this is I could have recorded this video, sent it to you in advance. You watch it in 10-minute chunks. And after every 10-minute chunk, we have an interaction, right? That's the way to do it. Now, we don't do that just because all our structures are so unshakable. Now, the other thing I'll say is I wasn't teaching, just to be clear, Tom. The other thing is I wasn't teaching. I was, frankly, telling a story. There's a narrative, there's an arc to it. And I was connecting some dots. And these are things you know as parents. I was invoking your history because as students, as parents, as practitioners, you get it. So I was not actually teaching, just to be clear.
But I also note that even in our interaction between you and me and the audience, that the coach function is coming through, and that's where the learning occurs in the nature of coaching. So thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I think coaching, we've got to really, I like to say that hierarchy. I grew up as you said, in India, and I went to school in India. I went to very good schools, but nonetheless, there's a lot of hierarchy there. You always call the teacher sir and things like that. And at MIT, every student, every freckled 17-year-old calls me dude, and that's my greatest honor, right? Why? Because I want them to respect me, and I want to respect them for what we are, not because of hierarchy. And I think hierarchy is a defense for the insecure, to some extent. And that's one of the great things about MIT is that professors are so accessible.
Yes.
And I think coaching also comes from that. You can ask me a question I don't know the answer to. I'll tell you I don't know the answer, and we'll find out the answer together.
Karen Aronson, thank you for your fascinating talk. Are some people inherently more curious than others? Are younger folks more curious than older? Are there ways to cultivate curiosity? And where does self-discipline come into learning?
Those are all brilliant questions. So first of all, I think every baby is curious. Otherwise, why would she learn language? Learning language is an intellectual feat greater than that, say, Einstein went through, right? Or accomplished when he came up with general relativity in his younger years in Zurich.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, curiosity is what drives humanity. I mean, and younger people are, and I think we spend decades beating it out of kids, to some extent, to be blunt about it. I actually think curiosity should be a pursuit, and I think it can be encouraged. I have the privilege and pleasure of being a professor at MIT, in which curiosity is my I get paid to be curious. But I actually, so for me, it's I have an advantage. But I see and meet people all the time who are just abuzz with curiosity, and I think we actually find those people interesting and intriguing and fun, and these are the people we want to hang out with. So absolutely, I think it can be awakened.
I once read a line that said, the cure for boredom is curiosity. There is no cure for curiosity.
And by the way, on the interdisciplinarity thing, self-discipline. Yes, self-discipline is a very important thing. And, there's a lot of work around it on grit, on the learning mindset. We also know, for example, things like we know that mindfulness helps, self-awareness. I actually think we should be teaching more of that. I mean, think about it. Our students come into MIT and they're going to spend 4 years learning, yet we never teach them how to learn. We never teach them about self-discipline. We don't teach them the psychology of it. This is something I hope we can fix, and I hope all of education can fix.
Randall Warniers, many students are excellent self-learners, while others thrive in the classroom with all its interactions. How do your learning models accommodate these different learning styles?
Yeah, just to be clear, the word learning style has associations which the term is used broadly, and in most respects, that term is incorrect. There was a fad about learning styles. I don't think you meant it that way here. It is true that different, some people are more introverted, some people are more extroverted, and that's why in-person can accommodate it all, right? That's why in-person is so good. And so perhaps someone who is more introverted, which actually I am, I like to study by myself and really sort of ponder about things, can benefit from talking to others and learn to sort of interact. And maybe people who are extroverted can see an introverted person, learn from them as well. So we can accommodate and in fact learn from each other. And you also know that, there's differences and it's all fine. So, but yeah, we do know there are differences. I just would suggest not using the word learning styles because it has connotations that have since been disproven. So it comes from an earlier fad that somehow some people were visual learners and some people were auditory learners, and turns out those buckets are incorrect.
Thank you. Paul Macapetra says, I enjoyed the talk, but I have to ask whether a talk with slides or other media might not be better.
We talked about it a lot. Paul, first of all, lovely to hear your voice. I've worked with Paul for 15 or 20 years. He's a pioneer in the internet. And every time you go to a website, you're using something that Paul wrote the first spec for. So great to hear from Paul. Paul, we talked about it. I do have slides, and we decided not to use slides. I'm happy to send them to you, my friend. And but I sold a book. There you go. There you go. Yes, there was an upside.
And speaking of people you know, my wife Ruth asks a question. Blended learning sounds great, but depends on the educators being brought up to speed. Are there things happening already to help educators become better coaches?
Not systematically, not systematically. I think that's got to happen systematically. I'll tell you the story of my daughter, who's now 18, but when she was 14, she learned, so she had a Spanish teacher only in America, by the way. His name was Senor Tran. He was Vietnamese American. And he was one of the most celebrated Spanish teachers in the country. And what happened was the kids started learning Spanish online using things like Quizlet and other things like that, various online media. And what he did was, in the classroom, he realized the kids already knew a lot of Spanish. So he turned the classroom into a place where they just wrote skits and they acted them out. And the kids couldn't wait to go to class. And then he would coach them as they were acting out the skits. So you see, that's a trick. That's a very profound trick. Do teachers know how to do this? No, we need to encourage them, give them the leeway. But it goes hand in hand with also finding the online resources. So a lot of teachers are sort of caught in between.
Connie Ostis, virtual online learning for young children is challenging for parents who need to be at their workplaces. They are dependent on schools for housing their children for long hours a day. How do you envision learning/teaching for young children post-COVID-19?
Well, I completely agree with that because education has become so much a part of the system. It's not a good to have. We need it as well for the rest of us to work. The system's evolved around that and optimized. But I do think that teachers can use online material in the classroom, group watching, discussion. So for example, 3 kids watch a video together and they present it and they ask each other questions about it, and you break it up into groups of 3, right? But it requires a rethinking of the entire classroom. Maybe the teacher motivates it, and says, why are leaves green? Well, it's chlorophyll. What do chlorophylls do? What does chlorophyll do? And so on. And then you watch the video on chlorophyll. It's a 10-minute, 7-minute lecture. And then you do something else. So it has to be restructured, and it's not easy.
Okay. John O'Connell, I agree that coaching is what teachers should be doing because learning is an individualized process. However, there may be a limit to the number of students that can be meaningfully interacted with at a time. How do we deal with this?
Great question. First of all, if you spend $18,000 per student or $15,000 per student, surely some of that, there's something's wrong if we can't coach students. Having said that, Maria Montessori should be celebrated as a hero because she discovered, actually, even before her, in Asia, it was discovered that peer-to-peer coaching is almost as valuable as expert coaching. Because if one student coaches another student, it clarifies both students' minds. And then what happens is the teacher can swoop in and say, you got that mostly right, but here's what I would do differently. and so the Montessori system sort of attempted to take some of that on. She did it by instinct. I should say that Maria Montessori, when World War II broke out, because she was Italian, she was put under, she was stuck in India, shall we say. And as a result, there's a big Montessori movement in India, and I benefited from it. And I can tell you, it materially changed me. I am what I am in part because of that. So yeah, so yes, coaching doesn't scale, but peer coaching helps.
George Starkshaw, any thoughts about adopting peer instruction for online education?
That's a great question, sir. And we do, in fact. So what we did was with edX courses, we have, so what happens if a student has, the great thing about online edX courses is the marginal cost is very low for us. Here's what happens. If you have 1 million students or 100,000 students and then 100,000 and first student joins, it doesn't cost us a lot more. The students have questions, they post them to forums or fora, and other students answer. And the TA watches the conversation. The act of answering questions actually flushes out a lot of misunderstandings. And then the TA weighs in and says, that was the right answer. So that's how we do both peer-to-peer and we get scale. And that's how we sort of address the question the previous person asked.
Claude Gerstle, should MIT have an admissions test to help pick the best candidates? What would it be? Would it be to find the best learners? What would be the parameters of that test?
So I went through such a system. I went to IIT, the Indian Institute of Technology, which had a very brutal admissions test. And we all had to, you had to be in the top 500 to get into mechanical, electrical, or computer science. And I made it. I met my wife there. She had a higher rank than me, actually. And, it has its benefits. It also has its downsides. Because if you could only reduce everything we look for in students to a math, physics, and chemistry test, I don't think we can. And there's a subjective quality to what we do at MIT, and I honestly think we should preserve it. But I'm also happen to be, the SATs, just to give you some more background, the SATs, IQ tests, on the one hand, you'll see this in my book, if you buy it, they were a little bit, there's a sort of there are pluses to them, but also negatives. For example, a lot of scientific racism was based on almost wanton misinterpretation of things like IQ. And the SATs baked in a lot of inequity. I mean, a few years ago, when my daughter was preparing for the SAT, she asked me, "Daddy, what is a regatta?" And I said, "Why do you need to know what a regatta is?" And she said, "It's in my SAT." And I'm thinking, well, that's a word that was put in there so that it's like a secret handshake for a certain class of people. She's fortunate I knew what it was, but some other child, their parent might not have. So I think SAT is wrong. Having said that, SATs do correct for certain other biases. So maybe some combination of standardized tests and well-written standardized tests might achieve the same purpose.
Paul Gluck, sometimes in our scheduled society, an hour's worth of content needs to be delivered via Zoom. Can you suggest useful ways to break up the content into bite-sized pieces?
Yeah, I think we should do stand-up classes where you give students online content where they can watch it at their own speed. The only good news here is, look, I don't have a quick answer, but if students could watch stuff online, on YouTube or something, and the class is at 15-minute jam session on what we just learned, right? Where every student presents a point of view, something like that. But but it's one way or the other. This is a bit of a mess and there's no easy answer.
I'm sorry, that was actually Peter Miller's question. My apologies to Peter. Paul Gluck's question was, how much of learning happens by interactions with other students?
A lot, because it's called elaboration. So when you learn something, if you have to describe it to someone else, it actually clarifies your own learning. And that's one of the secrets behind peer learning. The analogy I use is, we used to live in Belmont and we sold that house 10 years ago. And the only day it was clean and neat was the day we had our open house. So when you teach someone else, you're having an open house in your head. So you got to clarify your thoughts. And so teaching and writing also are a high form of thinking. And peer learning, for that reason, is very valuable. And coaching as well.
Thank you. Bob Moo, I have found that many that my most successful students are those who can ask questions or comments during a lecture. How can we incorporate this into edX or equivalent learning?
That's a fantastic question. So one of the, I complained about Zoom, but one of the great things about Zoom, by the way, is that Zoom is also equalizing, because there is no such thing as a backbencher in Zoom. And a lot of students who never speak in the classroom, we're finding, are very active in Zoom. Apparently the same thing is happening in the Supreme Court. Justice Thomas is speaking up a lot, apparently, because of the online medium. But there's something there, which is that, so in fact, when we come back to regular classrooms, we're thinking about recreating a chat function in the classroom. Students who might not speak up on the chat.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Peter Miller, if you have an hour's worth of content to communicate, how do you suggest breaking up a lecture? Wow.
Very interesting question. Let me tell you that if you do synchronous Zoom lectures, an hour's worth becomes an hour and a half. If you do asynchronous videos, which you plan in advance, an hour's worth of lecture becomes about 40 minutes. The rule of thumb. So if I gave this lecture, but I recorded it, it would take me about, 2/3 the time. And but then if I take but of course, this is not it's dynamic. If I take dynamics and I teach it in the classroom, but I want to do it over Zoom, it takes me longer. If I take dynamics and do a video, it takes me a shorter amount of time. So you can actually conserve time. It's actually better to shoot asynchronous videos, but it's difficult to shoot asynchronous videos. It's actually infuriating to shoot asynchronous video with an iPhone because it's going to sleep and all that stuff. And so I've done it, but you can do it.
Okay, we got room for one or two more. John O'Connell, I agree that coaching is what teachers should be doing because learning is an individualized process. However, there may be a limit to the number of students that can be meaningfully interacted with at a time. How do we deal with this?
Yeah, it's a great question, John. As I said, first of all, you want coaching should be something everyone does to everyone. It's a privilege. That's one. The second comment is that I think we do need to increase this base of coaching. So we have a class at MIT, 2007. Some of you will remember that Woody Flowers, who tragically passed away this year. He created it. 2007 is the robot contest. And what we do there is actually we go and recruit outside coaches, alums, people working in companies. And coaching is actually much more democratic. Being a star lecturer, some people are good at it, some people are indifferent at it. But coaching, it's amazing how good a lot of people are. Actually, a lot of researchers are also good coaches. Curious people are good coaches. Open-minded people are good coaches. So I think we need to expand the pool of coaches. And alums could play a huge role here, actually.
The two words that most resonate is curious and coaching from your talk. So thank you for that learning experience. Before I pass the baton on to Nancy Mims, I just wanted to specifically thank you, Professor Sarma, for your extraordinary insights, for focusing in on coaching and curiosity as the ideas that will stick with us. And I very much appreciate your willingness to share your time with us today. Nancy Mims is the admissions office, the Alumni Association's officer that handles the Cardinal and Gray administrative elements with extraordinary style. She's been doing it for a number of years. Nancy, I'm going to pass the baton to you now to close out the talk, this afternoon's talk, with an overview of what's to come in further sections of our series on The World Keeps Spinning at MIT. Professor Sarma, thank you. Nancy, you're on.
Thank you, Rick. On behalf of the MIT Alumni Association, Sanjay, I do want to offer our thanks as well. Thank you for spending time with us today. This has been you gave a wonderful talk, and this has been a great conversation. To our guests in the audience today, I want to thank you for bringing your questions and your curiosity to today's lecture. It's been a pleasure to listen to all of your questions, and we look forward to seeing you again before too long. In fact, I want to tell you about a couple of programs that are coming up soon. On November 17th, we'll have another talk in our series, and that will be Joanne Graziana, who is a lecturer from the MIT Media Lab, and she has been studying Catherine Dexter McCormick, and she's going to talk about Catherine's life and legacy. As you may know, she was a member of the class of 1904 and went on to have a great influence on our society today. On December 15th, we'll welcome Professor Sarah Seeger. She is an astrophysicist and will talk to us about her work in exoplanets as well as her new memoir. So with that, I want to thank you all again. We will be sending out a thank you email shortly, and we'll ask you to take a short survey. We'll also include a link to a place where you can purchase Professor Sarma's book if you like. So thank you all again, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks for joining us. And for more information on how to connect with the MIT Alumni Association, please visit our website.